Hey, D-Source, Davo here. Getting wiped out in a colony management sim sucks. Or does it? If you've ever enjoyed watching yourself be wiped out in a video game, there's a good chance that you are playing RimWorld. RimWorld is a game that'll kick you in the balls, but it'll have you coming back for more. It can be unforgiving. Rarely, it can be nice to you, but it does a great job at telling a story each time you play, which can be totally different to the last. It has a big focus on having unique and interesting colonists that, along with the generated events, will drive each story, which is where the game sets itself apart from other games in the genre. I have previously done a review on RimWorld, and yes, I did steal the intro from that video too, but I felt compelled to do a re-review, partially now because it's been fully released, and also because I didn't really like my old review much. It's pretty bad. My old style was the why video game sucks trope, and I think I was trying a little too hard to be negative. But I'm not going to come out now and say that RimWorld is perfect. It's a good colony management game and it's a better concept, but there are still some things that RimWorld doesn't do particularly well. Some of the mechanics still feel a little bit unpolished, and the visuals and UI could certainly do with an overhaul. But upon revisiting RimWorld, one thought in particular stood out to me. After being in early access for almost 5 years, is RimWorld really a 1.0? Probably the most in-depth mechanic of RimWorld is the functionality of your colonists themselves. Unlike many other games in the genre, your colonists are more than just workers. They're individuals with their own personalities and skills. While it might be frustrating at times, having to manage your colonists' well-being and mental fortitude is really one of the things that sets RimWorld apart from other colony management sims. And it's refreshing to not just have a bunch of robots with identical personalities that have no real reaction to the events around them. You need to make sure that they have all of their needs covered, such as making sure they have a table to eat at, because if they have to eat off the ground, they might just start lighting things on fire. Colonists will also interact and form relationships, which will also affect their mood and how they get along with one another. Personality traits, such as whether they're ugly or misogynistic and the like, will also affect this. The complexity of your colonists and how it affects their abilities and how they interact with the world is definitely one of the best parts of this game. Not only does it add another challenge and layer of depth, but it adds to the replayability. Any colony management sim or city builder should aim to be as replayable as possible and to allow you to have a new experience every time you play, and RimWorld has certainly done a great job in this regard. You've got randomly generated and unique colonists, multiple different gameplay styles and difficulties, multiple different starting scenarios, multiple different biomes to live in, and then all of the different random events that can happen on top of that. The replayability is where RimWorld shines. What RimWorld attempts to do first and foremost is tell a story, and it does it through the unique colonists you'll get and the generated events that occur, and your playthroughs will often end up going on different tangents and paths, which works very well for the game. Sometimes you'll build up a prosperous settlement, or sometimes your journey will end before it can even start. The disastrous nature of the world really sets the tone and embellishes the stories that the game tells. While I don't think that RimWorld is particularly unfair, I do think that some of the events are more annoying than they are an important plot point. For example, how easily fires can just devastate entire landscapes when you have a dry thunderstorm, or how inconvenient something like a solar flare can be when it knocks out all of your electric equipment. You can always play on easier difficulties, but that really detracts from what this game is about and how it plays. This isn't a game for sitting around and having a nice little tea party. The combat, in particular the gunplay, isn't great. It certainly fleshes out more in the late game, but in general, and particularly towards the start, it's a bit lame. The combat does end up being a little micro heavy, especially if you don't want your colonists to shoot each other in the back, because they'll find a way to do that. From combat also comes the need to treat the wounded, which can end up being quite grindy, especially if your colonists get infected. In general, the game can get rather grindy, but it's a colony management sim, so that kind of thing is expected. I will say that things such as raids do keep the game interesting, however, as it does also provide the opportunity to take prisoners, which can eventually be recruited, which certainly does add another layer to them rather than simply just defending the settlement. There are a few other things that keep the game interesting, such as the trading caravans that will come around to your settlement, and the missions that'll pop up on the map. Being able to form caravans of your own and even set up other outposts is also a neat little feature. One thing that really gets me is the end goal, to escape the planet. It just seems strange. Why would we, as the player, be interested in leaving the world that we've built upon when it's the only place we're invested in? I get that we've crash landed on kind of a shithole and that's the whole premise, but escaping the RimWorld just really wasn't what I wanted to progress towards. I wanted to, build and expand my colony as much as I could, not just run away from it. A lot of this game is improved by playing with mods, and I think therein lies a problem. I've said it before and I'll say it again, if a game needs mods to be good, wouldn't that imply that the game is not good? Look, I certainly don't think RimWorld Vanilla is bad, and it's certainly not on the level of Starbound when it comes to requiring mods to be interesting, but it's a game I wouldn't really play vanilla. It still has a few quirks and annoyances that can be fixed with mods, and credit to the modding community for being able to rectify that. Look, visually, RimWorld is not fantastic. I get that the visuals certainly aren't what makes or breaks a game like this, but I'm really not a fan of how the game looks. The overly simplistic designs with no real animation in games like this, or Prison Architect, really aren't my cup of tea. They're more like a half-full cup of juice that's been really watered down. Look, they're functional enough. The simple designs make it easy to differentiate between different items or workstations and between the foreground and background, but it's just ugly. The environments aren't great, and the mix between the top-down view for walls and structures and the more horizontally aligned character sprites looks pretty bad in particular. Another thing I'm not a huge fan of is the UI. If there's anything that'll convince me that this game is still an early access game, it's the UI. It basically hasn't changed from years ago and is really plain, boring, and not particularly intuitive. The music, on the other hand, is nice. The lonesome cowboyish guitar strums mixed in with the more sci-fi beats really help set the kind of mood that the game is going for. The sound design overall is pretty decent. It's basic, but it does the job. Not really a massive amount to go on about, but hey, I gotta try and hit the 10-minute quota somehow. So is RimWorld truly a 1.0? To be honest, I'm not 100% convinced that it is. I'd be more convinced if the game hadn't been in early access for so long, and having bought the game while it was still well inside its early access period, I haven't seen a colossal change. As I've said, it's not a game I'd really play without mods, and I think that mods get the game over the line to being a game that feels more like a definitive 1.0. But what does that say to the credit of the developers? I'd really have liked to seen more additions in the way of diplomacy with other factions, and certainly a bit of a visual overhaul, at the very least the UI. And while I can't argue that there have been additions, this game still feels very similar to the alpha versions from a few years ago. Some of the mechanics, in particular the combat, are still just a little unpolished, and despite the visuals really not being the most important part of a game such as this, they're ugly enough to put me off. There's still just a bunch of other little things that I would personally like to see fixed, such as the dead man's apparel annoyance or the random placement of factions around the map, and while these things can be easily fixed with mods, that just ties into my point that it's not really a game you would play vanilla. And yes, I understand that the point of mods is to add or improve upon a game, but a standalone game should always be definitive and fully fleshed out in its vanilla. It's not quite on the level of Starbound vanilla blandness, but RimWorld still does feel a little lacking on its own. But despite all of this, RimWorld still does hold its own not only as a colony management sim, but as a storytelling device as well. It can be cruel at times, but the atmosphere it sets and the story it creates is certainly what RimWorld does best. It's important to recognize that this is not the game for everybody. If you're chasing a more cruisy, easygoing colony builder, then RimWorld probably isn't the sort of game you're looking for. It uses the unfortunate setting and random disasters and happenings to help drive each of its individual stories, which is where the game really shines. If you're after something more softcore when you're in more control of your settlement and the environment, RimWorld might not be the game for you. And for the asking price of $50 Australian, it might not be the game for your wallet either. There are certainly much cheaper options in this genre, but it does have its own unique style and ability to tell stories that many other colony sim games cannot, which it should definitely be credited for. Do I think RimWorld is a bad game? No, it's far from it. It's a fresh concept, and I've enjoyed my 80 odd hours that I've spaced out over its development. And if you're a colony sim enthusiast or a serial masochist, then it's definitely a game I would recommend. And I think that the game not quite being truly a 1.0 means it has room to expand, and the development team seem invested in it. Hopefully they'll keep rolling out a few more additions and updates in the future. Because while you might get wiped out after something absolutely ridiculous happening to your colony, at least you can leave a cool Steam review about it afterwards, and then do it all over again.